You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This is another episode about entrepreneurship, and today I'd like to talk about the entrepreneurial mindset. What kind of a mindset do you need to do entrepreneurship? And more importantly for me, how does doing entrepreneurship change your mindset? Because I think one of the things about the entrepreneurial mindset, if you read about it online, you find articles saying, think like an entrepreneur, and this is the way to be successful, is to develop this mindset. And I do think there is a mindset that works better for you if you are an entrepreneur. But in my experience, it's also the case that doing entrepreneurship itself trains you in this way of thinking, in this mindset, and it helps you develop this way of thinking, almost like developing muscles if you exercise. Actually doing entrepreneurship trains you in thinking like an entrepreneur. One of the things that I've spoken about before is just how different the entrepreneurial mindset is to the mindset that you get from school and even from university and higher education. And just as it is the case that, when you're in school, you're kind of programmed to think in a certain way, I think doing entrepreneurship actually programs you to think in a different way too. It encourages a different mindset and a different type of thinking. So I'm going to talk about what the entrepreneurial mindset is in my experience, and I'm also going to talk about how doing entrepreneurship is the best way to develop this mindset. Because it is certainly true that your mindset has a huge impact on the outcome of whatever activity it is that you're doing. And everyone recognizes that you can influence the level of your success by the mindset that you adopt. And that is probably best summarized in Funkadelic's 1970 song title, "Free Your Mind and Your Ass Will Follow." But what I want to argue in this podcast is that the opposite is also true, that what it is that you do has a huge impact on your mindset, and by doing entrepreneurship, you can actually change the way that you think. So you can say, free your ass and your mind will follow. And that's what I want to talk about in this episode. So let's talk about what the entrepreneurial mindset is and how doing entrepreneurship changes the way that you think. The first thing that really occurs to me about the entrepreneurial mindset is optimism. When I started my business, a friend of mine once said to me, before I'd really made any sales, that really the only thing I had to sell was my optimism about the business itself, and that was what I was selling. And I think he was right, actually. That is sort of all that you've got in the beginning, is your confidence that you can make something work. And it is basically a can-do attitude. And the reason that I think this is so important is because of just how hard entrepreneurship is. Steve Jobs actually summarized this far better than I can. So I'm just going to play you a quote from Steve Jobs about the importance of passion and perseverance.
People say you have to have a lot of passion for what you're doing. And it's totally true. And the reason is because it's so hard that if you don't, any rational person would give up. It's really hard. And you have to do it over a sustained period of time. So if you don't love it, if you're not having fun doing it and you don't really love it, you're going to give up. And that's what happens to most people, actually. If you really look at the ones that ended up being successful, unquote, in the eyes of society and the ones that didn't, oftentimes it's the ones that are successful loved what they did so they could persevere when it got really tough. And the ones that didn't love it quit because they're sane, right? Who would want to put up with this stuff if you don't love it? So it's a lot of hard work, and it's a lot of worrying constantly. And if you don't love it, you're going to fail. So you got to love it. You got to have passion.
I think that quote from Steve Jobs really summarizes it perfectly. I suppose of all the things that I'm going to talk about, this is the one thing that I had in the beginning of setting up my business. But I do also think that the process of working on the business helped me to strengthen my resources of optimism and perseverance. If you go into business and you are working to make the business work, you will find those resources because there's no way of getting through otherwise. The second part of the entrepreneurial mindset that I want to talk about is what you might call the trial and error approach to doing things. What that means, I think, in terms of your mindset is an acceptance of failure, an acceptance that most of the things that you try and do don't work, and you have to go back to the drawing board and think again and work out how to try again. This is so crucial because there is just so much failure in trying things out. It's in the same way that the market itself is a sort of evolutionary process of trial and error, businesses starting and trying things and evolving and changing. You yourself, as part of that market, will be a kind of trial and error machine. You know, your role in the business is to try and move forward. You don't know which different strategies are going to work in advance, but you have ideas about what you think will work, so you try various things and you find that things don't work out in the way that they're supposed to in your mind. They work differently, so you have to go back to the drawing board and think of a new strategy and work out how to move forward. And you often also find, surprisingly, that things that you didn't think would work that well work far better than your expectations. And so that process of being willing to try things and have them fail is absolutely vital. And I learned a huge amount of that through entrepreneurship. I think that is also something that I came into entrepreneurship with, because I was very interested in the scientific method, and this is the method of experimentation in the sciences as well. But it's also something that you really learn in your gut when you're doing entrepreneurship. And you experience so much failure in doing entrepreneurship that I think it really strengthens your ability to try things and to go for things, because you do learn from experience that failure is not the end of the world, that it doesn't matter if you try and fail. When I started the business, I actually was quite conscious of this in the very beginning, because I thought, I'm going to do this for 5 years, and if it doesn't work out, I'll end up with nothing, but I can still then go back into a paid job somewhere and everything will be all right. Now, as it turned out, the project lasted 11 years, not 5 years, but I was aware, even starting the business itself, that there was a possibility that it would come to nothing, and that was okay. And I think that attitude is something that only strengthened in doing the business, that you are willing to look at the opportunity as something that could work, but also might not. And if it doesn't, it's not the end of the world. You'll find a different way of getting to where you want to go. Another aspect of the entrepreneurial mindset, I think, is a real deep-rooted selling mentality. I've talked about this in previous podcasts, but this is really something that I learned through doing entrepreneurship. When you start your own business, you learn so quickly how vital sales are and how much work goes into generating sales, that you also learn that selling and the mentality of selling, which is a mentality of voluntary persuasion, is something that is fundamental to all business. That really, as an entrepreneur, you are a salesman. That's your job. Your job is to sell all the time to everyone. You've got to sell to your customers the benefits of your product. You've got to sell to your employees the benefits of working for you. You've got to sell to your stakeholders the benefits of lending you money or whatever it is, if that's what you're doing. So this is something that you really start to take into your bones through doing entrepreneurship. And I came from, before entrepreneurship, I came from an academic background. I did an undergraduate degree, an MSc and a PhD, and I'd been a consultant doing commercial work during my time in academia, but I was still very much from an academic background. So it's through doing entrepreneurship that I really learned the value of selling. And I also think that you learn humility through taking sales really deep into your bones. A lot of people think of salesmen as being very brash and pushy. Actually, in my experience, really doing a lot of sales teaches you humility, because it teaches you not to think that anything is going to be given to you as a matter of course. It teaches you not to feel entitled to anyone else buying anything. You realize you have to find ways to give people things that they want and to persuade them of the benefits of what it is that you're doing. And so it really flushes out of you any kind of entitlement mentality that you get left over from school. When you're in school, you have this way of life forced on you, which is you've got to jump through these hoops and then we're going to give you these certificates. So, if you do your homework and you do X, Y, and Z, then you will get your grades. And so you learn that, well, I have to do my homework and then I'm owed the grade that comes from doing that homework. And that goes on into higher education, university, all the way through that kind of academic entitled mentality. Whereas in selling, you find yourself in a person-to-person relationship where you have to understand this other person and understand what are their needs and how can I help them and how can I provide value to them. And you also understand that there's no guarantee that they will be interested in the value that you think you might be able to provide. So it teaches you a huge amount of humility. And it also teaches you humility just because there is, again, so much failure in selling. There's so many attempted sales for every sale that goes through that you learn to accept that you have to keep trying. And that, again, fits in with the sort of trial and error mentality that I was talking about. I think the next thing that entrepreneurship does to change your mindset, and that you can also do to develop that mindset, is really that it makes you focus very clearly on being results-oriented, being real-world results-oriented. And what I mean by that is that you become very much focused on what the outcome of what it is that you're doing is going to be, and on measuring that outcome. So rather than getting involved in just doing stuff for the sake of doing it, you become very, very focused on how will I know if what I'm doing is successful? What can I measure to see whether this is working? And you become very interested not in intentions, but in results. So you become interested in looking at not what you think will work or what you hope will work, but what actually works. And that really means that you get focused very much more on the outcome rather than the activity. And you get focused on what people do, not what they say. Again, this sort of fits in with some of the things that I've talked about on previous episodes about the importance of measuring everything that you're doing in your business and being very conscious of how the business works so that you can actually adapt and change and do more of the more successful things and less of the less successful things. But as a mindset, I think what it does is it really focuses you on thinking about results and being very much focused on what the outcome will be, not what the intention is. And that, again, I think gives you another sort of lesson in humility, because you start realizing that that applies to everything, including yourself. In terms of your own activities, it's the outcome that you start to become really concerned about rather than your own intent or effort. So, for example, I was, in the beginning of my business, very, very interested in writing white papers about how great our product was. And I was also very interested in developing the R&D of the software itself, because these were interesting technical problems that I was interested in solving, how to make software do something very technical. And I was also interested in telling people about how I'd solved these technical problems and what the outcome is. Now, the fact is that didn't actually sell anything. And in order to actually get people to buy the consultancy services that we were doing, I had to change my approach and reorient my activities. And another example is that when we first started our business, I expected us to be providing something online in terms of application service provision. And after a couple of years, we still had not got that framework up and running, and nobody ever bought anything online from us. Our services had all been consultancy services where we were selling consultancy. And I had to learn that that was the way that we were able to actually provide our service, was through consultancy projects, and to change my activities in line with the results that we were getting, because that's where the money was coming from. The next thing I think doing entrepreneurship teaches you is it really teaches you thrift. It really teaches you to look at cultivating a reluctance to waste time and money on anything. And this really links very closely to being results focused. When you do entrepreneurship, there's so much to do and you're under so much pressure that you really want everything that you do to count. And given that you're actually working with your own money in this business, you also want to make as much money as you can. So you want to make every penny that you spend count and invest all your money wisely in the growth of the business. And what that means is that you learn to really avoid make work. So you learn to never do anything unless you can see that it's going to be useful, that it's going to actually have an impact ultimately on results on the bottom line. You learn to avoid spending money unless you can see how it's going to make an impact and what the results are going to be. So you cultivate this reluctance to spend time and money on anything. It's a kind of cultivated laziness about spending, both in terms of your time and your money. It's an attitude of, why should I spend this? Why should I do this? What is it going to actually achieve? And consequently, you learn to change your mindset from the mindset of school, where you are incredibly focused on showing how busy you are, where you show teachers all the things you've done that are very active and busy, to a focus where you are still incredibly busy. You just can't avoid being in entrepreneurship usually, but you become very much more choosy about what you're willing to be busy about. So you become reluctant to spend unless you can see the outcome, and you start really evaluating the use of your time and the use of your money down to the penny. And that, I think, is a mindset that really serves you well in life in general. Because thrift, I do believe, is an important virtue, not only in terms of your business, but in terms of your personal finances and your personal life too. If you become an entrepreneur and if you do entrepreneurship, you will learn that so quickly. If you're not thrifty now, you will certainly learn to be thrifty in the process of doing it. The last thing I think that entrepreneurship teaches you in terms of your mindset is it really teaches you a kind of market orientation of doing things. There's nothing like being in the marketplace to actually make you think about free, voluntary, market-based solutions to problems. Anyone who really goes into business on their own, sets up their own business, learns far more about the potential of the market than they can ever do so by being an academic or by being involved in non-market-based jobs. I gained a fundamental respect for voluntary ways of solving problems by people working together. And I think that definitely is part of the entrepreneurial mindset. Being an entrepreneur really makes you think about how any problem can get solved by people working together and cooperating voluntarily in a marketplace. And you start to see voluntary solutions to all kinds of other problems in life. And that was certainly my experience, was that the process of being an entrepreneur opened my eyes to the potential for all human interaction to be voluntary, and for people to find ways of living peacefully and cooperatively together without a state, without force, without violence, but only through persuasion and voluntary cooperation. And I think that's something that being an entrepreneur, that will change your mindset. That will open your mind to those kinds of possibilities more than reading about the market will ever do. You will learn more about the market by being in it than you can ever read about. So with regard to all of these aspects of the entrepreneurial mindset, if you're not an entrepreneur now, you can certainly develop these ways of thinking, and you can be conscious of them and be as aware of them as possible to help you. And certainly the more you are consciously developing this kind of attitude or mindset, the more it will help your entrepreneurship. But there's nothing like doing it to help you develop the right mindset. So my experience was being an entrepreneur changed the way that I think, and it freed the way that I think in many, many ways. You can work on freeing your mind and your arse will follow, but it's also true that if you free your arse, your mind will follow. I hope that's helpful, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you have feedback about the show, please email jake@thevoluntarylife.com. If you enjoyed this program, please share the podcast with your friends or click the donate button on thevoluntarylife.com.